was a bright spring morning at Arlington National Cemetery. The air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers from nearby trees. The sunlight fell softly on the rows of white marble headstones that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was a place of peace and quiet, where every visitor spoke softly, out of respect for those who rested there. Among the few people walking the clean stone paths that morning was an elderly man named Harold Benson. He moved slowly but with purpose, his step steady even though his body showed the weight of age. He wore a neatly pressed jacket, an old military one that still fit him well. The jacket carried several medals pinned neatly on the left side, each one telling a silent story of courage and sacrifice. On his head sat a faded cap embroidered with the words, U.S. Army Veteran. Harold had come to the tomb of the unknown soldier, a place that held deep meaning for him. He had served during the Vietnam War and many of his friends had not returned. To him, the tomb wasn't just a monument. It was a promise that those who gave their lives would never be forgotten. As he approached the area, he noticed the tomb guard pacing with precise measured steps. The guard's movements were smooth, deliberate, and filled with discipline. Every click of the guard's shoes echoed softly through the still air. Visitors stood silently behind the ropes that marked the boundary of the tomb's area. No one dared to disturb the guard's ritual. Every minute, the guard turned with perfect precision, taking exactly 21 steps, then paused, facing the tomb, before repeating the pattern. Harold had seen it many times before, but it always filled him with the same deep sense of pride and respect. He stopped near the front, standing a short distance away from the ropes. His old hands trembled slightly as he took off his cap. The breeze brushed gently through his thin white hair. Slowly he raised his hand in a salute. His fingers weren't as steady as they once were, but his heart was strong. His eyes glistened as he looked at the marble structure before him. Memories flooded his mind, of long, humid days in Vietnam, of brothers in arms laughing, of the silence that followed after battles. He could still hear their voices in his heart, even after so many decades. A small group of visitors nearby noticed him. Some of them whispered quietly to each other, realizing that he was a veteran. A mother leaned down and told her young son to watch and learn. "That man served our country," she said softly. The boy looked at Harold with wide eyes, watching the way the elderly man stood so still and proud. Harold didn't notice the attention. He was lost in his thoughts. In his mind, he was 20 years old again, standing shoulder to shoulder with his friends. He remembered how back then they were all full of energy and hope, even when the world around them was uncertain. He remembered how they used to talk about the future, about coming home, finding jobs, starting families. Some of them never got that chance, and that was why he came here every year on this same date to honor them. A single tear rolled down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. It wasn't a tear of sadness, it was a tear of gratitude. Gratitude for having known such brave men, for having survived when others did not, and for being able to stand here today in their memory. The tomb guard turned once more, his steps echoing softly against the marble floor. Harold admired the young man's discipline. The guards were known for their strict training and deep sense of duty. They guarded the tomb day and night through rain, snow, and scorching heat, never allowing the honor of the site to fade. Harold respected that deeply. He knew the value of duty, and he could see that same spirit alive in this young soldier. As the minutes passed, more people gathered quietly around the area. Some took photos from a respectful distance. Others simply stood in silence, taking in the solemn atmosphere. The sound of birds chirping faintly in the distance blended with the rhythmic footsteps of the tomb. Gardery. It was a peaceful harmony that seemed to belong only to this sacred place. Harold lowered his salute after several moments and placed his cap back on his head. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool morning air. For a brief moment, he felt young again. The aches in his knees and the stiffness in his shoulders seemed to fade away. In that quiet space, surrounded by memories and respect, he felt whole. He began to take a few slow steps toward a nearby bench. Every step reminded him of the years that had passed, of the distance between who he once was and who he had become. But he wasn't sad, he was proud. Each wrinkle on his face told a story of survival, each gray hair a reminder of time earned. Sitting down, he looked once more at the tomb guard. The guard was now facing the tomb, motionless, his rifle resting perfectly at his shoulder. The sight brought a small smile to Harold's face. He knew that such devotion was not easy. It took discipline, patience, and respect, values that had guided his own life. As he sat quietly, an older couple joined him on the bench. They too were veterans. They greeted him kindly, and for a few minutes they shared gentle conversation about the past, about old times, about friends lost and lessons learned. Their words were soft, carrying the weight of shared experience. They didn't need to say much. Sometimes a nod was enough to say everything. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting gentle light across the cemetery. The marble tomb shone like white fire in the daylight. Harold took out a small folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was a letter he had written years ago, a message to his fallen friends. Every time he came, he read it quietly to himself. His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried emotion that only a soldier could understand. When he finished, he folded it again and placed it gently back in his pocket. He looked around, noticing that some visitors were watching respectfully. A few nodded in appreciation. It wasn't about fame or recognition for Harold. It was about keeping a promise to never forget. For him, the tomb was more than stone. It was a living memory. It reminded everyone that peace had been bought at a great cost. It reminded him that duty and honor never fade, even when the years pass and the body grows old. As Harold rose from the bench, he adjusted his jacket and cap once more. The tomb guard was turning again, his movements sharp and precise. Harold straightened his back and gave a final salute before walking slowly toward the path that led away from the site. Every step felt heavy, but also full of pride. He didn't know that this peaceful morning would soon turn into something unexpected. For now it was just a moment of silence, of gratitude, of peace. A moment that seemed frozen in time. The air around him was calm, the sound of footsteps steady and rhythmic. The tomb of the unknown soldier stood tall behind him, watching silently as it had for generations. Harold took one last glance before leaving. "Rest easy," he whispered softly. Then he walked away, unaware that fate was about to test not just his courage but the honor of the very ground he had come to respect. The sky was still bright, and a gentle wind passed through the trees that lined the cemetery paths. Harold was sitting quietly on the same bench, his hands resting on his walking stick. He had decided to stay a little longer before going home. Watching the tomb guard perform his silent duty brought him peace, and he wanted to hold on to that feeling for just a while more. Visitors continued to arrive, moving respectfully and speaking in low voices. Some were families. Others were young people taking photos and reading the information plaques nearby. Most were calm and quiet, understanding that this was a sacred place. But then the soft peace of the morning began to change. From the far end of the walkway, a group of young men appeared. They were in their early 20s, dressed casually, carrying phones and small bags. At first, no one paid much attention to them. Visitors often came in groups to see the tomb of the unknown soldier. But soon, their loud laughter and careless words broke the silence that usually surrounded the memorial. They didn't walk with the same quiet steps as others. Their shoes scraped noisily against the stone path, and their voices echoed in the open space. A few visitors turned their heads, frowning slightly. The tomb guard continued his walk, his focus unbroken. But anyone who had been there before knew that unnecessary noise was not allowed near the tomb. The young men stopped near the ropes, pulling out their phones to film videos. One of them began to talk loudly into his camera, saying how they were visiting some famous grave. His tone was playful, careless. It showed that he didn't understand where he was or what it meant. Harold watched them from the bench, his eyes calm but serious. He had seen this kind of behavior before. Young people who didn't yet know the weight of history. He stood up slowly, adjusting his cap, and walked closer to the rope. He didn't plan to say anything. He just wanted to stand quietly as he had done earlier. But one of the young men noticed him and laughed. "Hey, look," he said to his friends. "Old soldier still saluting." The others chuckled, not realizing how their words carried in the quiet air. Harold didn't react. He looked straight ahead at the tomb, his eyes steady. To him, the laughter was just noise. He had faced far worse in his life. He wasn't going to let a few careless words disturb his respect. Still, the sound made some other visitors uncomfortable. A mother nearby held her child's hand and gently moved farther away. A man in a suit shook his head, whispering something about manners. The young men didn't seem to notice. One of them started talking again, this time pretending to imitate a soldier standing at attention. His exaggerated movements made his friends laugh even louder. The moment felt wrong, not because of anger, but because the peace of the place was being broken. The tomb guard noticed. Though he continued his routine, his sharp eyes turned briefly toward the noise. His duty was not only to guard the tomb, but also to protect the dignity of the site. The guard didn't speak yet, but his expression grew firm and focused. His silent gaze alone was enough to make a few onlookers grow quiet again. Harold, still standing near the rope, took a slow breath. He understood that not everyone knew how to behave in such a place, but he wished they would. To him, the tomb was not just a symbol, it was sacred ground. Every stone there represented lives lost for freedom and peace. It deserved respect, not laughter. One of the young men noticed that Harold wasn't reacting. Maybe he thought it was funny, or maybe he wanted attention. But he started walking a little closer. He spoke loudly, asking if Harold had fought in some old war. His tone wasn't curious, and it was mocking. Harold finally turned his head and looked at him, not with anger, but with calm authority. His voice, though soft, carried weight. "Show some respect, son," he said. "This is a place of honor." The young man smirked, then shrugged. "Relax, old man," he said. His friends chuckled again, but a few of the visitors gasped quietly. Everyone knew that talking like that in front of the tomb was unacceptable. The guard stopped mid-step. He turned sharply, facing the direction of the disturbance. His shoes clicked against the stone floor, echoing through the air. In that moment, the atmosphere changed completely. The laughter faded, replaced by uneasy silence. The guard's face was calm but serious. He stood tall, every line of his posture filled with discipline. His voice came out deep and clear, trained to carry authority without shouting. "Maintain silence," he said. "You are standing before the tomb of the unknown soldier." The young men froze for a moment. They hadn't expected anyone to speak to them that way, especially not someone in uniform. A few visitors nearby began to whisper, recording the moment quietly on their phones. Harold stayed still, his gaze fixed on the tomb. He didn't want a scene, but he appreciated the guard's composure. For a few seconds, everything was quiet again. The young men seemed unsure what to do. Some of them lowered their phones, while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. But one of them, perhaps too proud to admit he was wrong, tried to joke again. "We're just looking," he said, waving his hand dismissively. The guard didn't move, but his tone became firmer. "Show proper respect or leave the area," he said. There was no anger in his voice, only the strength of someone who stood for something far greater than himself. The words carried weight. Even the breeze seemed to still for a moment. One of the young men muttered under his breath, but the others were beginning to understand. They could feel the eyes of everyone around them, families, veterans, tourists, and the silent guard who represented years of tradition and sacrifice. The laughter that had once filled the air was gone. In its place was the heavy realization that they had crossed a line they didn't fully understand. Harold took a step closer, his old voice steady but kind. "This place isn't just stone," he said softly, speaking more to the air than to them. "It's about people who gave everything they had. You don't have to know their names. You just have to remember why they're honored." His words, gentle yet full of truth, seemed to settle over the space like a calm wave. For a moment, even the young men were quiet. The guard nodded slightly in Harold's direction, a silent acknowledgement of shared respect. After a few seconds, the guard resumed his slow, precise walk. The rhythmic sound of his shoes returned, echoing through the marble space. The young men stood still, no longer laughing. Something about the seriousness of the place had finally reached them. Harold returned to his bench, his movements slow but dignified. He didn't hold anger in his heart. He had seen too much in life to be bitter. Instead, he hoped the young men would remember this day, not as a moment of embarrassment, but as a lesson about respect, courage, and the meaning of sacrifice. As the guard continued his silent watch, the peace of the cemetery returned. The air felt lighter, calmer. The other visitors slowly began to move again, whispering softly among themselves. A few even looked at Harold with admiration for how calmly he had handled the situation. The young men lingered for a while longer, but their energy had changed. They spoke in quieter tones now, their laughter replaced by quiet thought. The weight of the place and its history, its meaning, had finally settled over them. Harold leaned back on the bench, watching the tomb guard continue his perfect steps. He smiled faintly. Sometimes, he thought, people just need a reminder. The sun was starting to dip a little lower in the sky, painting the marble tomb with a golden light. The breeze carried the faint rustle of leaves and the stillness returned stronger than before. The moment of disrespect had passed, leaving behind a lesson in silence and dignity, one that Harold hoped would last far beyond the gates of the cemetery. The air in the cemetery had grown still once more. Visitors continued their quiet walks, taking photographs from a respectful distance or stopping briefly to read plaques that told the stories of those who had served. Harold Benson, the elderly veteran, had returned to the bench near the tomb of the unknown soldier. He rested his hands on his walking stick and gazed quietly at the guard, whose every step seemed in perfect harmony with the sacred rhythm of the memorial. The young men who had caused a brief disturbance earlier lingered nearby, speaking in whispers among themselves. They looked uncomfortable now, no longer laughing, their energy subdued by the solemnity of the place and the gentle authority of the tomb guard. But one of them, perhaps testing boundaries or still failing to fully understand the moment, took a small step closer to the rope, brushing against the invisible line that separated the visitors from the guards area. Harold noticed immediately. He did not move to intervene. His years of experience had taught him that confrontation was rarely the right way. Instead, he simply stood and placed a calm, steady hand on his walking stick. His eyes, sharp even in age, locked on the young man. There was no anger, only quiet disapproval. His presence alone seemed to ripple through the air, a reminder that respect was not optional here. The young man smirked, pretending not to notice Harold, but the others nudged him, whispering warnings. Their laughter from before had completely disappeared. They were beginning to understand that this place was unlike any other they had visited. There were rules of honor here that went beyond ordinary behavior, rules that were written not in words but in courage, sacrifice, and history. The tomb guard, sensing the tension, paused mid-step. He had seen many situations before, but each moment required careful judgment. His rifle rested perfectly against his shoulder, his movements as precise as a metronome. He turned slightly, facing the young men, his eyes sharp yet composed. The silence around him seemed to deepen, and even the distant rustle of the trees was muffled in respect. Harold took a deep breath, steadying himself. "Remember," he said softly but firmly, "this is not a place for jokes or games. This is sacred ground." His voice carried across the small gathering of visitors, calm but filled with authority. The young men froze. They hadn't expected the elderly man to speak to them, and his calm confidence surprised them more than the presence of the guards had. One of them tried to respond, muttering something about just having fun, but Harold shook his head. "Fun doesn't belong here. What belongs here is respect. Respect for those who gave everything so others could live freely." His words were quiet but resonated with the weight of years of experience. The air seemed to shift around him. The young men glanced at each other, realizing they were being observed by not only Harold, but also by the guards. Their playful bravado from earlier was gone. They felt the gravity of the moment pressing down, and for the first time they truly understood that their behavior had been inappropriate. There was no anger, no harsh words, only the silent weight of understanding beginning to settle in their minds. Harold took another slow step closer to the rope. "It's never too late to do the right thing," he said. "Stand back, speak softly, and honor what you don't yet fully understand. That is all anyone asks." He did not raise his voice. There was no need. The quiet strength in his tone demanded attention and respect. The guard resumed his measured steps, but his eyes never left the group. He was calm, disciplined, and ready to act if needed. But he also knew that sometimes presence alone could teach lessons more powerfully than words or force. Every visitor around watched, silent and still. Even the small children clinging to their parents seemed to sense that something important was happening. The young men exchanged nervous glances. One of them lowered his phone, realizing that filming the situation had not been appropriate. Another whispered an apology to his friend, perhaps more for himself than for anyone else. It was clear that they were beginning to grasp the lesson being quietly but firmly delivered. Harold returned to his bench slowly, taking deliberate steps that showed dignity and calm. He did not gloat or express satisfaction. That was not his way. He simply settled back, resting his hands on his walking stick once more, and watched. He knew that people learned more from quiet authority than from anger. The guard, now resuming his full pace, walked in the same precise pattern, each step echoing in the still morning. The rhythm was almost hypnotic, and it seemed to draw the young men's attention involuntarily. Their earlier energy and mischief were replaced with a silent curiosity, a desire to understand why this place mattered so deeply. As Harold observed, he thought back to his own years of service. He remembered moments when discipline, respect, and courage had been the difference between chaos and survival. He saw now that the lesson he was teaching these young men was similar, that honor is not given. It is recognized, understood, and practiced even by those who have not yet experienced it fully themselves. The young men, now standing quietly, began to move back slightly, giving more space to the sacred area. One of them muttered almost to himself, "I didn't realize. I didn't get it before." Harold nodded, not in judgment but in quiet acknowledgement that learning was happening. A few visitors smiled softly at Harold, seeing the way he handled the situation. They understood that this moment, though simple and quiet, was powerful. Respect was being restored, and the dignity of the tomb remained intact. The guards continued their silent watch, every step a demonstration of commitment, and the young men began to follow the unspoken rules of silence and honor that surrounded them. Harold leaned back slightly, taking a deep breath. For a moment he closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing that even small actions, a calm word, a quiet presence, could make a difference. The young men were no longer a distraction. They were learning, witnessing, and beginning to understand the gravity of what had seemed so ordinary to them before. The cemetery returned to its usual rhythm. The sound of birds chirping softly in the distance mingled with the echoing steps of the tomb guard. Visitors moved along the paths, speaking in low tones, paying homage silently. Harold watched as the young men finally stepped back fully, their posture no longer playful but cautious, respectful. It was in that moment that Harold realized something important. Teaching respect did not require confrontation or anger. It required presence, understanding, and example. He had learned it in his own life during years of service, and now he was seeing it passed on, even to those who had not yet known the weight of sacrifice firsthand. He looked at the tomb guard, whose eyes met his briefly. The nod between them was subtle, almost invisible, but it carried recognition and approval. Both men understood the lesson that had been taught silently in that quiet morning hour. The young men eventually turned and walked away, quieter than before, speaking in subdued tones. Harold didn't know whether they would remember this day forever, but he hoped that the feeling of respect would stay with them, shaping their understanding of honor and courage. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting a golden glow across the white marble tomb. The air carried a peaceful hush, broken only by the occasional gentle rustle of leaves. Harold took a final slow look at the guard, the tomb, and the small group of visitors who had gathered. Everything felt in its proper place. He stood, carefully placing his hands on his walking stick. With a steady heart and quiet pride, he took one last look at the tomb of the unknown soldier. "They are not forgotten," he whispered to himself, a promise to the past, to the brave souls who had given everything, and to the future, in hopes that respect would continue to be understood and honored. And as Harold walked slowly away, the cemetery returned to its serene rhythm. The guards continued their silent, disciplined watch. The visitors moved quietly along the paths, and the young men had learned, in their own quiet way, that some places are sacred, and some lessons must be felt rather than spoken. The morning had moved into early afternoon, and the sunlight now cast long, soft shadows across the rows of white headstones. Arlington National Cemetery remained quiet, save for the occasional footstep of a respectful visitor or the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Harold Benson, the elderly veteran, had remained nearby, walking slowly along the stone paths. He carried his walking stick, which tapped softly against the ground, each step measured and deliberate. His eyes, bright despite his age, scanned the surroundings. Though the previous disturbance with the young men had settled, a feeling of anticipation lingered in the air, as though the cemetery itself was watching. The young men from earlier were still there, lingering at the far edge of the memorial area. Their voices were low now, barely above whispers. They were no longer playful or disrespectful. Instead, their energy had shifted from mischief to a kind of nervous curiosity. They glanced at the tomb guard repeatedly, who continued his silent patrol with the same disciplined, precise steps. Every click of his shoes against the stone floor reminded them of the importance of this place, of the solemn duty he carried. Harold noticed the change in their demeanor. A faint smile crossed his face, but it was subtle, a quiet acknowledgement that the lesson had begun to take root. He remembered times in his own life when lessons had been learned not through words but through experience and observation. The young men were now experiencing the weight of history in a way that no lecture could provide. But just as the calm seemed fully restored, one of the young men, perhaps out of nervous energy or confusion, took a small step forward, closer to the restricted area near the tomb. It was a casual movement, almost instinctive, but it was enough to draw attention. The tomb guard, as always, noticed immediately. He stopped mid-step, his posture as sharp as ever, and turned to face the potential threat to the sanctity of the area. Harold, observing from a distance, felt a familiar sense of vigilance rise within him. Years of experience in the military had taught him to assess situations calmly, to measure risk, and to intervene only when necessary. He did not move toward the young man yet, but he prepared himself to speak should the moment demand it. The young man, sensing the focused attention on him, froze. He glanced at his friends, who all looked equally tense. The playful energy from earlier had completely vanished, replaced by the realization that they were now fully accountable for their actions. The seriousness of the tomb guard's presence, combined with Harold's quiet authority, had shifted the atmosphere entirely. Harold slowly stood from his bench, his walking stick tapping lightly on the stone. He walked forward, his steps deliberate but unhurried. His eyes met the young man's, and in that simple gaze there was no anger, only understanding and expectation. Harold's voice when he spoke was calm but firm. "Step back," he said. "This is sacred ground. It must be respected." The young man hesitated, then took a small step back. One of his friends whispered something, likely an apology, and the group collectively shifted farther from the rope that marked the boundary of the tomb. Harold nodded slightly, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement. It was enough. The tension that had briefly returned began to ease. Meanwhile, the tomb guard resumed his patrol. Each step was perfectly timed, each movement precise and deliberate. The guard's disciplined presence seemed to reinforce the lesson that Harold had just delivered. The young men now watched quietly, fully aware that they were witnessing a moment of responsibility and respect, even if they did not yet fully understand the depth of its significance. Harold returned to his bench, his steps slow but dignified. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. Around him, other visitors observed the scene quietly, some whispering softly among themselves. Many recognized the teaching moment unfolding before their eyes. A child tugged gently at a parent's sleeve, asking questions about the soldier on the bench, the tomb guard, and the rules of respect that govern this sacred space. Harold spoke softly to the child, explaining in simple words. "These men gave their lives so that we could live freely," he said. "This place honors them, and it is important to show respect even if we don't know their names. Watching, listening, and learning, that is a way of honoring them too." The child nodded solemnly, understanding the importance of stillness and reverence. The young men, now fully aware of their behavior, remained at the edge of the memorial area. Their energy had changed completely. There was no trace of disrespect left. They spoke quietly among themselves, reflecting on what they had witnessed. One of them muttered almost inaudibly, "I didn't realize. I didn't understand before." Harold heard the words but said nothing. Sometimes understanding had to come from within, without prompting from others. As the minutes passed, Harold observed the tomb guard's continued vigilance. The soldiers' movements were almost hypnotic in their precision, a living demonstration of discipline and dedication. Each step seemed to carry a message. Honor is not earned by words alone, but by actions and commitment. Harold felt a deep sense of respect for the young man standing there, dedicated to a duty that required immense focus and patience. A few visitors approached Harold cautiously, asking questions about his own service. He answered quietly, sharing stories from his years in the military without exaggeration or pride. His tone was humble, yet every word carried the weight of experience. He spoke of camaraderie, courage, and the importance of honoring those who could not speak for themselves. His stories captured the attention of those listening, including the young men who now stood in the background absorbing every word. The atmosphere remained calm, yet charged with a quiet intensity. Every step, every glance, every gesture seemed to carry meaning. The young men had begun to understand in a small but significant way that actions and attitudes mattered. They were learning that respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned through recognition of what was greater than oneself. As Harold leaned back on the bench, he noticed that the group of young men were beginning to talk quietly among themselves, reflecting on their earlier behavior. One of them looked directly at him, eyes filled with a mix of apology and realization. Harold offered a small, encouraging nod. No words were necessary. The acknowledgement alone was enough. The tomb guard completed another cycle of his steps, and the quiet rhythm of the tomb seemed to fill the space with a sense of serenity. The young men had moved to the edge of the memorial area, their attention focused fully on the lesson they had been given. Visitors continued their own quiet walks, speaking softly, some stopping to observe the scene unfolding. Harold took a deep breath and smiled faintly. Moments like these reminded him why he continued to visit the tomb, even after so many years. It was not only to honor the fallen, but also to witness the impact of presence, respect, and discipline on those who had yet to learn these lessons. The young men, now fully aware of their surroundings and the gravity of the place, eventually began to step away from the memorial. Their conversation was subdued, respectful, and thoughtful. They no longer sought attention or recognition. Instead, they carried with them the understanding that some places required quiet reverence and that actions had meaning beyond the immediate moment. Harold watched them leave, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. No confrontation had been necessary. No anger had been expressed. The lesson had been taught through presence, calm authority, and example. The cemetery returned to its peaceful rhythm, with visitors moving softly along the paths, the breeze whispering gently through the trees, and the tomb guard continuing his perfect, measured steps. As Harold prepared to leave, he took one last look at the tomb. The sun now shone directly on the marble, making it gleam in the bright light. He placed his cap back on his head, adjusted his jacket, and whispered softly, "They are learning. They will remember." He walked slowly along the path, each step steady and full of purpose, carrying with him the knowledge that honor had been preserved, dignity had been restored, and respect had been quietly but firmly reinforced. The day continued on in its serene rhythm. The tomb guard's steps echoed softly against the stone. The young men had moved away, thoughtful and reflective, and the other visitors carried on their quiet visits, each person absorbing the history, sacrifice, and meaning in their own way. Harold's presence, calm words, and steady example had made a lasting impact, not just on the young men, but on everyone who witnessed the subtle power of respect, discipline, and quiet courage. By the time the afternoon sun had reached its highest point, the atmosphere at Arlington National Cemetery had shifted back to its usual serenity. Visitors moved along the clean stone paths with quiet steps, pausing to read the inscriptions on the headstones or simply taking in the beauty of the memorial grounds. Birds chirped softly in the distance, and the gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the towering trees that lined the cemetery, adding a sense of peace to the solemn place. Harold Benson, the elderly veteran, had remained nearby for most of the morning and early afternoon. His presence had been calm, respectful, and observant, but the events of earlier had left an impression not only on the young men who had caused the disturbance but also on him. He reflected quietly on what had occurred. Years of experience in the military had taught him that discipline and respect often spoke louder than words. He had seen it happen again today. Even the small actions, the quiet reminders, and the calm authority of the tomb guard had guided the young men toward understanding without force, confrontation, or anger. He watched them from a distance as they lingered at the far end of the memorial area, now quieter and more thoughtful than before. Their previous energy, once filled with mischief and carelessness, had transformed into a subtle respect, a quiet acknowledgement of the importance of the sacred ground on which they stood. Harold thought about how easily lessons in life could be missed if not presented with care and patience. Today had been an example of such a lesson. The young men began to speak softly among themselves, their tones subdued and reflective. They shared observations about the guards, the careful movements, the discipline that they had observed, and the quiet authority of Harold himself. One of them said almost in awe, "I didn't realize it mattered so much until I saw it." Another nodded in agreement, acknowledging the weight of respect that must be given to those who had sacrificed for others. The conversation was no longer light-hearted or playful. It carried sincerity, understanding, and even a hint of gratitude. Harold watched the interaction and allowed himself a small, approving smile. He understood that the lesson was sinking in. The young men were beginning to grasp that some places demand quiet reverence, that honor is not a performance for attention, and that respect is earned not only through words but also through awareness, observation, and understanding. It was a lesson that could not be fully taught in a classroom or with a stern lecture. It had to be experienced, felt, and reflected upon. Meanwhile, the tomb guard continued his precise and disciplined patrol. Every step remained measured, every motion deliberate, as though each movement carried a silent message of history, sacrifice, and dedication. The guard's unwavering presence served as a living reminder that duty and honor are timeless, and that even small acts of respect, standing quietly observing the rules, remaining aware of one's surroundings, hold deep significance. Harold began to walk slowly along the stone path, his walking stick tapping gently with each step. He felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the young men had learned something important that day. There was no need for anger or confrontation, no need for dramatic gestures or loud words. Respect had been restored naturally, quietly, and effectively. It was a moment that highlighted the power of presence, humility, and calm authority. As Harold passed by other visitors, he noticed that many were observing him with admiration. Some of them had witnessed the interaction earlier, while others had only seen the aftermath, a group of young men now quietly reflecting on their behavior. A few approached him cautiously, asking questions about his military service, his thoughts on the tomb guard, and the meaning of the memorial itself. Harold answered with quiet dignity, sharing stories of camaraderie, courage, and sacrifice. He spoke in simple words that were easy to understand, yet they carried a depth of experience that resonated with everyone who listened. The young men, now positioned a respectful distance away, watched Harold speak to the visitors. They listened, absorbing the wisdom that came from years of lived experience. In that moment, they began to understand that the lessons of honor and respect were not confined to one place or one time. They were values to carry throughout life, in every situation, in every interaction. Harold paused near a small garden adjacent to the tomb, where flowers had been carefully planted in neat rows. He looked at the vibrant colors of the blooms, the care with which they had been arranged, and he thought about how similar that care was to the discipline of the guards and the respect expected of visitors. Beauty, honor, and dedication all required attention, thoughtfulness, and patience. He smiled faintly, appreciating the lesson that nature itself seemed to reflect. Nearby, a young child approached with their parent. The child looked up at Harold and asked softly, "Were you a soldier too?" Harold nodded gently, his eyes reflecting warmth and humility. "Yes," he said. "I served a long time ago, but I come here to remember my friends and to honor those who cannot speak for themselves." The child listened intently, absorbing the words with wide eyes. "It's important to remember," Harold continued, "and it's important to be kind and respectful wherever you go." The parent smiled, grateful for the quiet lesson. Harold returned the smile with a nod and continued walking slowly along the path, taking in the peaceful surroundings. He noticed that even the young men, who had earlier been disrespectful, were now standing quietly nearby, paying attention to the calm authority of both the guard and the veteran. They were learning not only from what had happened, but from observing the conduct of others who carried themselves with dignity. As the afternoon moved on, Harold approached the main entrance of the tomb area for one last look. The tomb guard continued his steady patrol, moving in perfect rhythm, unwavering in focus. Visitors came and went, observing quietly, paying their respects in their own ways. The young men had moved further away, speaking softly to one another, reflective and thoughtful. The scene was calm, serene, and filled with a sense of quiet accomplishment. Harold took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face and the gentle breeze through his hair. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that respect and honor had been preserved. The young men had learned an important lesson without confrontation or anger, guided instead by calm authority, example, and gentle words. It was a moment that he would remember, a moment that would stay with him as a reminder of how powerful quiet guidance could be. Before leaving, Harold paused near the tomb one final time. He placed his hand on his heart and whispered softly, "They are not forgotten. The words were meant for the fallen, for those who had sacrificed everything, and for the visitors who had witnessed the events that day." The phrase was a promise, a recognition that honor and memory endure, even in the face of carelessness or misunderstanding. He turned to the young men who were still nearby and offered a small nod. It was not a lecture nor a reprimand, but a gesture of encouragement and hope. One of them hesitated, then nodded in return, a silent acknowledgement that they had learned something valuable. Harold did not speak, and there was no need. The understanding was mutual, conveyed through presence and quiet respect. As Harold slowly walked away, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond personal pride. He had witnessed the power of calm authority, dignity, and presence. He had seen respect restored, not through confrontation but through example and quiet guidance. The young men had learned, the visitors had learned, and the cemetery remained a place of honor, peace, and reflection. By the time Harold left the grounds, the afternoon sun had begun to dip toward the horizon, casting a golden light across the white marble tombstones. The cemetery was calm, serene, and timeless. The tomb guard continued his watch, precise and unwavering. Visitors moved quietly along the paths, absorbing the history, courage, and sacrifice represented in every stone, and Harold, walking slowly but steadily, carried with him the knowledge that even a small act of calm guidance could make a lasting difference. He paused one last time at the gate, turning back to look at the tomb of the unknown soldier. The marble gleamed in the warm light, the guard's figure a symbol of discipline and honor, and the quiet visitors a reminder that respect and learning could continue in small, meaningful ways. Harold whispered softly, "May their memory live on," before continuing down the path toward the exit. His steps were slow, steady, and full of purpose, carrying the lessons of the day into the wider world, a living example of dignity, courage, and respect for all. The events of that day, though simple and quiet, had created a ripple effect. Respect had been restored, understanding had been gained, and the young men would leave with a lesson they could carry for a lifetime. Harold, too, would carry the memory, a reminder of how presence, patience, and quiet authority can touch lives, even in the most unexpected ways. As the sun finally set behind the trees, the cemetery returned to its tranquil rhythm. The guards maintained their silent vigil, the visitors departed quietly, and the young men walked away thoughtful and reflective. Harold, feeling content and at peace, knew that the dignity of the tomb and the memory of those who served had been honored once again. A quiet victory for respect, courage, and humanity.